Tonight, we explore 100 theories for the fall of Rome, not to find a single answer, but to understand how civilizations truly end. I am your host, and tonight we take a fireside nap. Theory number 1. Edward Gibbon famously argued that the adoption of Christianity acted as a slow and secret poison that sapped Rome of its civic virtue and military spirit. This theory suggests that the new faith preached a doctrine of patience and pusillanimity, causing the last remains of the martial flame to be buried in the cloister. As the church grew into an independent state within the heart of the empire, it diverted vast amounts of wealth and manpower that were desperately needed for state administration and border defense. The focus of the Roman elite shifted from the secular survival of the state to the spiritual salvation of the soul, effectively hollowing out the imperial structure from the inside. This internal transformation left the empire a stupendous fabric yielding to the pressure of its own weight. By replacing the ancient Pax Deorum with a monotheistic zeal, the empire allegedly lost the cultural foundation that had sustained its conquests for centuries. Ultimately, the cross replaced the eagle, and the empire fell not to a sword, but to a creed. Theory number 2. The barbarian invasions are often viewed as the final, violent blow that murdered the Roman West. Driven by the terrifying advance of the Huns from the Eurasian steppe, Germanic tribes like the Goths and Vandals were pushed into Roman territory in an unsustainable domino effect. This was not a singular event, but a century-long process of systematic dismemberment, where the empire's physical defenses were simply overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the migration. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 served as a precursor, proving that a barbarian force could decimate a Roman field army and kill an emperor in royal splendor. Eventually, the sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 shattered the myth of the city's invincibility, a trauma from which the Roman psyche never truly recovered. By 476, when the chieftain Odoacer deposed the last emperor, the Western Empire had been reduced to a patchwork of independent barbarian kingdoms. The Eternal City became a barren ruin, and the glory of the Caesars was extinguished by the barbarian torch. Theory number 3. Rome's fall was fueled by a desperate and reckless policy of currency debasement that turned the empire's money into a worthless product spewed out by the mints. For centuries, the silver denarius had been the bedrock of global trade, but as emperors faced rising military costs, they began mixing pure silver with plebby base metals like copper. This frantic financial debauch saw the silver content plummet from a nearly pure 95% under Augustus to a staggering 0.5% by 265 AD. Caracalla accelerated this death spiral by introducing a double denarius that was nominally worth more but contained significantly less silver, an act described as the first great overt act of depreciation. By the time of Gallienus, coins were merely bronze cores with a thin silver wash that quickly wore off, exposing the poor quality underneath. This systematic destruction of the currency's intrinsic value acted as a hidden poison, hollowing out the economy before a single barbarian stepped across the Rhine. The empire's silver engine melted into rusty iron and bronze. Theory number 4. As a direct consequence of debasement, hyperinflation tore through the social fabric of Rome, causing prices to explode by 1,000% across the empire. In the early years, inflation was a negligible 0.7%, but by the late 3rd century, it had surged into a frenzy of 35% per year, impoverishing all social strata. This economic apocalypse paralyzed long-distance trade as money lost its power as a means of payment and the empire dissolved into an inefficient local barter system. The middle class was completely wiped out by the skyrocketing costs of staple goods, while the wealthy fled to fortified country villas to hoard assets and evade the state's crushing tax collectors. Diocletian's desperate attempt to fix the economy through price controls only fueled the black market and caused supplies to vanish entirely from the city. By the 5th century, the Roman economy was no longer modern. It had become a medieval landscape of subsistence. Rome was a failed and outdated project, strangled by its own worthless money. Theory number 5. For centuries, Rome's real advantage was its inexhaustible reservoirs of manpower, the ability to lose 3 field armies and simply raise others to take their place. However, this Hydra-like resilience was eventually broken by a severe manpower crisis triggered by waves of pandemic disease and incessant civil wars. The depopulation of the western provinces was so sharp that the state could no longer replenish its legions after major defeats, leaving the borders dangerously thin. Large tracts of fertile land were abandoned, appearing in the records as agri deserti, because there were no longer enough farmers to work the soil or pay the taxes. This demographic decline forced the empire into a strategic nightmare where breaches of the frontier could not be prevented, only responded to after the fact. By the 5th century, the empire was a hollowed-out giant, possessing a massive bureaucracy but lacking the human energy to sustain its own survival. The legions vanished because there was no one left to bleed for Rome. Theory number 6. As the native Roman population shrank, the empire became terminally dependent on barbarian mercenaries known as foederati. While the army had used auxiliaries for centuries, the late empire began admitting entire tribes who served under their own kings rather than Roman officers. This barbarization of the military led to a crisis of command, where the real power in the West was held by generals like Stilicho and Ricimer, who were Vandal or Goth by descent and acted as kingmakers for puppet emperors. These troops often lacked a primary loyalty to the Roman state, and when they were mistreated or unpaid, they turned their weapons on the very city they were hired to protect. The army was no longer a machine for Romanization, but a collection of autonomous ethnic units with conflicting interests. This internal instability meant that the Roman army, once the envy of the world, was eventually decapitated by its own defenders. The sword of Rome was held by hands that were increasingly alien to its cause. Theory number 7. The emergence of Sassanid Persia as a peer superpower in the 3rd century dealt a fatal blow to the strategic balance of the Roman world. Unlike their Parthian predecessors, the Sassanids were a centralizing force, united on a straightforwardly anti-Roman ticket. They announced their arrival with 3 massive victories, famously capturing Emperor Valerian, who was used as a footstool and then skinned after death. This new threat forced Rome to permanently focus a much higher proportion of its fiscal and military resources on the east, creating a dangerous power vacuum in the west. Every time an emperor turned to face the great king in Persia, the Rhine and Danube frontiers were left exposed to barbarian raiding. The Roman state had to adapt to a two-front reality that it was never economically designed to handle, leading to the irrevocable administrative split of the empire into halves. Rome was stretched to the breaking point by a peer competitor that refused to be conquered. Theory number 8. In 1605 AD, the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, erupted with the force of a neutron bomb, ending Rome's happiest age and beginning its long decline. Carried by soldiers returning from the east, this biological catastrophe claimed between 7 and 8 million lives, killing up to 10 to 20% of the empire's population in just 2 decades. It was the first of 3 pandemics to level the Mediterranean, acting as a microbial mass murderer that shattered the institutional resilience of the state. The sudden loss of life caused a collapse in silver mining and industrial production, forcing the government to begin the fatal cycle of currency debasement to pay the army. By killing the very labor base that sustained the empire's growth, the plague introduced a slow and secret poison into the vitals of Rome, ensuring that it could never again achieve the same margin for error. Nature had launched its first biochemical assault on human ambition. Theory number 9. Occurring during the crisis of the 3rd century, the plague of Cyprian, possibly Ebola or a similar fever, was an exogenous shock that brought Rome to its knees. At its peak in 251 AD, reports claimed 5,000 people a day were dying in the city of Rome, with disposal teams unable to keep pace with the mounting corpses. This pandemic occurred just as the empire was splintering into separate states and facing a Sassanid invasion, creating a perfect storm of misery. The plague decimated the military ranks, making it almost impossible for the barracks emperors to defend the borders against the Goths and Franks. Beyond the physical death toll, the plague had a profound psychological effect, fostering the spread of new faiths like Christianity as the populace sought meaning in an increasingly apocalyptic world. It was a biological catastrophe that stripped the empire of its last remains of stability, paving the way for a more authoritarian, medieval state. The city of Rome became a shambles of the dying. Theory number 10. The Justinian Plague of 541 AD was a landmark event in the history of the human species, acting as a global killer that effectively ended the ancient world. This was the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague, and it arrived just as Emperor Justinian was on the verge of reclaiming the lost western provinces. The beast was carried by ship-borne rats through Rome's trade networks, eventually killing an unfathomable 50 million people, or half the population. Combined with the year without a summer in 536 and the onset of a little ice age, the plague sapped the Byzantine Empire of its economic and military vitality. It prevented the permanent restoration of the West and left the Mediterranean a desolate wasteland of abandoned cities and empty fields. This biological disaster ensured that the empire would remain a rump state, unable to resist the future rise of Islam. the ancient world died in the fever dreams of a billion fleas. Theory number 11. The late antique Little Ice Age, or Lalia, was a cataclysmic environmental shock that shattered Roman stability in the 6th century. Triggered by a series of massive volcanic eruptions in 536, 539, and 547 AD, a literal year without a summer plunged the Mediterranean into a deep, century-long cold snap. This northern hemispheric cooling caused harvest failures and widespread famine, leading to significant political and social unrest. The empire's metabolic regime was unable to feed its starving urban centers, as the sun was darkened by a persistent dust veil for 18 months. This sudden shift from a benign climate to a hostile, frozen world sapped the productivity of the agrarian economy, which was the very engine of Roman power. By depleting the plant and human energy reserves, this little ice age yanked the rug out from under Justinian's efforts to reclaim the West, leaving the Mediterranean a desolate wasteland. Theory number 12. For centuries, Rome flourished during the Roman climate optimum, a unique period of warm, wet, and stable weather that fueled unprecedented demographic and agricultural growth. However, this moment suspended on the edge of nature came to a crashing end as the Mediterranean transitioned into a cooler, more arid world. This shift toward aridification was a slow and secret poison that systematically undermined the high-yield agriculture of the Nile and other breadbaskets. Without the smiling sun and reliable rainfall of the previous era, the empire's margin for error vanished, leaving it fragile in the face of political and military shocks. The transition to this less favorable Holocene climate sapped the empire's resilience, transforming once fertile lands into non-productive regions. Ultimately, the collapse of this enabling environment ensured that the empire could no longer sustain its massive population or its expensive military machine. Theory number 13. The loss of North Africa to the Vandals in 439 CE was the single most devastating economic blow to the Western Roman Empire. Led by the ambitious King Genseric, the Vandals seized the breadbasket of the empire, including the vital hub of Carthage. This conquest effectively cut off Rome's primary grain supply, leaving the capital city and its millions of residents to face the prospect of starvation. Beyond the food crisis, Africa was the West's most reliable tax base, providing the liquid capital necessary to pay and equip the Roman legions. Without this revenue, the imperial government was paralyzed, unable to put effective forces in the field to defend Gaul or Italy. The Vandals then used their new naval supremacy to strike the heart of Rome at will, ensuring the Western Empire remained in a state of terminal economic collapse. This systematic dismemberment of the empire's wealthiest province was the final nail in the coffin. Theory number 14. Systemic overtaxation became a self-destructive engine of collapse as the state desperately tried to fund its massive military. To pay for incessant wars and a bloated bureaucracy, emperors levied crippling tax rates on marginal land, driving the peasantry into absolute poverty. This created a vicious cycle where small farmers abandoned their land because the tax burden exceeded the soil's productivity. To ensure tax revenue, the late Roman state resorted to brutal, corrupt regimentation, legally binding workers to their jobs to create hereditary castes. This was the structural birth of medieval serfdom, as the middle class vanished and wealth retreated to fortified country villas to evade the state's reach. The government reacted like a frightened child at the controls of a runaway express train, pushing tax levers that only further stifled trade and industrial production. Ultimately, the empire was taxed to death, leaving a disenfranchised population with no stake in Rome's survival. Theory number 15. The administrative split of the empire following the death of Theodosius I in 395 CE turned a unified superpower into two competing, often hostile entities. While the wealthy and stable East, centered on Constantinople, flourished, the poor West was left to defend a massive frontier with dwindling resources. This permanent division between the brothers Arcadius and Honorius meant that the two halves could no longer effectively coordinate military funding. When the West faced the full weight of barbarian incursions, the East often stood by or even bribed the invaders to move towards Italy instead. This power vacuum in the West was exacerbated by fierce rivalries between regional strongmen who used barbarian tribes as pawns in their internal squabbles. The split was irrevocable, leaving the Western Empire a rump state that could no longer rely on the vast wealth of the East to survive. Ultimately, this bisection was an imaginative experiment that got a little out of hand, sentencing the West to final dissolution. Theory number 16. Anthropologist Joseph Tainter proposed that Rome succumbed to diminishing returns on complexity, where the cost of maintaining the empire eventually outweighed its benefits. As the state confronted systemic problems, it added layers of bureaucracy and military presence, each requiring an ever larger energy subsidy from the population. Initially, Rome solved these shortages through territorial conquest, looting the energy surpluses, gold, grain, and slaves of its neighbors. However, as the empire grew to a stupendous fabric, the cost of maintaining its infrastructure, garrisons, and civil government became unsustainable. Eventually, every new challenge, such as a crop failure or a barbarian raid, required more resources than the empire had left to give. At this tipping point, the empire's marginal return on complexity turned negative, making the system so fragile that it naturally fragmented into smaller, more manageable units. For many citizens, the collapse was actually a rational preference, as they were better off without the crushing tax burden of an overbuilt state. Theory number 17. The incessant civil wars of the late empire acted as a self-inflicted wound that hollowed out the Roman state from the inside. During the crisis of the 3rd century, the barracks emperors came to power through blood, with more than 50 generals vying for the throne in just 50 years. This cycle of usurpation and assassination eroded the political capacity to maintain a disciplined army, as troops became loyal to their individual paymasters rather than the state. While Roman legions were busy butchering each other for the purple robe, the borders were left undefended, allowing barbarians to raid deep into the provinces unchallenged. These internal conflicts sapped the strength of Rome, as emperors were forced to make their own military less effective to prevent ambitious subordinates from launching revolts. Ultimately, the continuing grind of civil wars proved more deadly than any foreign foe, leaving the empire a shattered shell by its final hour. Theory number 18. A controversial theory suggests that widespread lead poisoning may have quietly crippled the Roman upper class, leading to mental decline and physical sterility. Proponents argue that the elite consumed a Greek-style diet where food was cooked in lead-lined containers and wine was sweetened with sapa, a syrup rich in lead-2 acetate. Furthermore, the city's sophisticated water supply flowed through extensive lead piping, ensuring that even daily hydration introduced toxins into the blood of the aristocracy. This chronic exposure supposedly resulted in chronic gout, dementia, and infertility, preventing the ruling class from producing talented heirs to lead the state during crises. While many modern historians discount this because ancient authorities were aware of lead's dangers, the idea of a toxic empire remains a viral topic. If true, the very technological sophistication that defined Rome became its silent biochemical assassin. Theory number 19. Long-term environmental degradation systematically stripped the Roman Empire of its natural resource base, turning fertile provinces into barren wastes. Centuries of aggressive deforestation to fuel the empire's massive industries and heating needs led to catastrophic soil erosion. Atmospheric evidence captured in Greenland ice sheets shows a massive spike in methane, proving that Rome's environmental impact was global and destructive. This was compounded by excessive grazing, where herds of livestock stripped the meadows, further destabilizing the topsoil and causing widespread desertification. As the land became non-productive, small farmers were forced into overpopulated cities, creating a demographic crisis the state could not manage. This unintended conspiracy with nature saw the Romans exhausting their ecological capacities, leaving them unable to feed their population as the climate grew colder. The mother of the world was eventually choked by the ruin of her own soil. Theory number 20. Soil salinization proved to be the hidden killer of Roman agriculture, particularly in the once vital provinces of North Africa. The empire's reliance on intensive irrigation technology to feed its urban millions came with a lethal side effect. Without suitable drainage systems, salt accumulated in the topsoil. This process eventually turned fertile fields into sterile salt wastes, causing a permanent decline in food production capacity. As the breadbasket regions became non-productive, the empire's redistributive food supply system collapsed, triggering chronic famines that fueled social unrest. This environmental Newton's third law meant that the very technologies used to colonize risky environments eventually destroyed the landscape they were meant to master. By the time of the final invasions, the empire was already an ecologically exhausted system, its agricultural engine stalled by its own hand. If you've made it this far into the video, make sure to subscribe. We plan on making many more videos like this in the future. You can make that happen by simply liking and subscribing. Theory number 21. The Huns were not merely a mindless barbarian horde. They were armed climate refugees fleeing a world-ending catastrophe on the Eurasian steppe. Driven by a severe and unrelenting mega-drought, these nomadic warriors were forced westward in a desperate search for survival, creating a territorial domino effect that pushed every other Germanic tribe directly into the path of Rome. This exogenous shock transformed environmental desperation into a military juggernaut that the empire's depleted legions could no longer suppress. The Huns arrived as nature's first move in a global collapse, proving that the most dangerous enemy is one with nothing left to lose in its own desiccated homeland. Their presence signaled the beginning of a conspiracy with nature that would eventually leave the Western Empire in ruinous pieces. Theory number 22. As the Roman state became a frightened child at the controls of a runaway express train, the wealthy elite enacted a strategy of total seclusion and ruralization. Retreating to massive fortified country villas known as latifundia, the aristocracy successfully built private islands of safety where they could evade the imperial tax collectors. This mass exodus of wealth and leadership from the city to the country signaled the death of urban dominance and left the central government financially paralyzed. These luxurious rustic estates gradually transformed into the precedents for medieval castles, as local lords began to exercise more authority over their surrounding territory than the distant, crumbling emperor. The cities, once the beacons of Romanitas, were left as hollow shells, drained of the resources and the elite minds required to sustain a superpower's existence. Theory number 23. In a final, desperate bid to preserve its failing tax base, the late Roman state resorted to corrupt, brutal regimentation, stripping its citizens of their most basic freedoms. To ensure a steady flow of revenue for the army, emperors enacted legislation that legally bound workers to their jobs and land for eternity. This policy created a system of hereditary castes, where the son of a farmer was born a colonus, shackled to the soil of his father's estate in a generational prison. This was the structural birth of medieval serfdom, an act of total social stagnation that murdered the social mobility that had once made Rome great. By the time the barbarians arrived, the Roman social structure was already medieval, its people living as disenfranchised tools of an authoritarian machine. Theory number 24. Emperor Diocletian attempted to legislate away the fundamental laws of economics with his disastrous edict on maximum prices in 301 AD. By prohibiting the raising of prices on over 1,300 essential products on pain of death, he intended to curb hyperinflation, but instead triggered a total economic suicide. Producers and intermediaries, refusing to sell at a loss, immediately withdrew their supplies from the white market, causing goods to vanish into a thriving black market, where real prices surged even higher. This upward spiral of failure forced the empire into an inefficient local barter system, effectively paralyzing long-distance trade and industrial production. The state's attempt to play God over the market only accelerated the economic apocalypse, leaving its citizens to starve amid piles of worthless silver and gold. Theory number 25. Edward Gibbon famously theorized that Rome's fall was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness, suggesting the empire had simply become too heavy for its own foundations to support. This stupendous fabric yielded to the pressure of its own weight as the causes of destruction multiplied with every new league of conquest. Prosperity itself ripened the principle of decay, creating a top-heavy military colossus with financial feet of clay that required a level of maintenance the ancient world could not provide. In this view, Rome did not need an external enemy to strike the final blow. It was a structure destined to collapse into its own ruins by reaching a point of complexity that was ecologically and fiscally unsustainable. Theory number 26. The parenthesis asserts that the Roman world actually survived the barbarian invasions, but met its true violent end during the Islamic expansion of the 7th and 8th centuries. This provocative theory suggests that the Arab conquests ruptured the Mediterranean trade routes, cutting Western Europe off from its economic lifeblood and turning the region into a stagnant, agrarian backwater. The Eternal City fell not to the Goths' torch, but to the total economic isolation that followed the loss of its wealthiest provinces in North Africa and the Levant. Under this model, the ancient world finally died when the Mediterranean was no longer a Roman lake, but a divided sea that separated the new East from the destitute medieval West. Theory number 27. Gibbon argued that the Roman people suffered a terminal loss of civic virtue, as the once proud martial flame was buried beneath a new culture of pusillanimity and religious distraction. The governing classes experienced a failure of nerve, abdicating the role of defending the state to foreign mercenaries while they retreated into the sanctuary of the cloister or the luxury of the palace. This moral decay meant that the citizens received the name without adopting the spirit of Romans, abandoning the duties of public service for the sake of private salvation. By the time Alaric stood at the gates, the people had lost their Romanitas, the very collective consciousness and military vigor that had once made the empire an unbeatable force of human will. Theory number 28. The widening disparity between the opulent city dwellers and the barely civilized peasantry left the vast majority of the population with no stake in the empire's survival. As inequality reached its zenith, the concentration of land and wealth in the hands of a few senators created a society of disenfranchised laborers who viewed the Roman tax collector as a more immediate threat than any barbarian king. This massive decapitalization of the poorest classes turned the Roman project into a failed and outdated venture for the common man, who often found himself better off under barbarian rule than under the crushing weight of imperial greed. Rome did not fall because of its enemies' strength, but because its own people had no reason to fight for its preservation. Theory number 29. As military overspending and inflation drained the treasury, Rome's legendary infrastructure began to slide into terminal disrepair, signaling the functional end of ancient urban life. The sophisticated underground sewage systems and grand aqueducts, the engineering markers of civilization, were neglected until they became unusable, leading to chronic water shortages and disease. The destruction of the aqueducts during the Gothic War of 546 was the final, devastating blow that forced the population to flee the once magnificent metropolis. The Eternal City was reduced to a barren ruin, its great public baths closed, and its grand streets buried under layers of silt and decay, because it had lost the technological and fiscal capacity to maintain its own standard of living. Theory number 30. The late empire was strangled by a monstrous governmental bureaucracy that became a fertile breeding ground for rampant corruption and embezzlement. High-ranking officials like Rufinus were renowned for their dishonesty, illegally seizing assets and taking bribes while the state faced its final hours. This culture of systemic greed alienated the populace and ensured that vital resources intended for border defense were siphoned off into the pockets of the elite. The empire fell apart from within as its own corrupt administrators and idle mouths proved more effective at dismantling the state than any foreign army could ever hope to be. Rome's final defeat was an administrative one, where integrity was bartered for gold until there was nothing left to save. Theory number 31. The late empire was strangled by a monstrous governmental bureaucracy that became a fertile breeding ground for rampant corruption and embezzlement. High-ranking officials like Rufinus were renowned for their dishonesty, illegally seizing assets and taking bribes while the state faced its final hours. This culture of systemic greed alienated the populace and ensured that vital resources intended for border defense were siphoned off into the pockets of the elite. The empire fell apart from within as its own corrupt administrators and idle mouths proved more effective at dismantling the state than any foreign army could ever hope to be. Rome's final defeat was an administrative one, where integrity was bartered for gold until there was nothing left to save. Theory number 32. Violent religious schisms between competing Christian sects acted as a jagged blade, tearing apart the social cohesion of the late empire. Even after Constantine legalized the faith, the Arian controversy turned cities into battlegrounds, with the patriarchs of Alexandria, Rome, and Constantinople feuding over the minute metaphysical nature of the divine. These were not mere academic debates. They were landmark events in the history of human species that triggered riots, assassinations, and state-sponsored persecutions. As emperors like Constantius II and Theodosius I leaned into orthodoxy or Arianism, they alienated vast portions of their own subjects, making them more sympathetic to barbarian kings who often shared their heretical views. The empire was so busy arguing about the substance of the sun at the Council of Nicaea that it failed to notice the barbarian at the gate. By the time the final invasions began, the Roman people were no longer a unified body, but a collection of warring congregations, more interested in spiritual purity than imperial survival. Theory number 33. A pervasive psychological state known as the Great Fear began to settle over the Roman world, eroding the collective will to survive. This wasn't a physical invasion, but a terminal loss of public confidence fueled by a century of constant anxiety over civil war and invasion. Poets like Virgil and Horace had once sung of empire without limit, but the late Roman writers breathed an apocalyptic atmosphere, depicting the world as a faded papyrus that no longer spoke to the living. As the frame of the fragile world appeared to collapse, a sense of status dissonance and malaise led the elite to abandon public service for private safety. This was a failure of nerve on a civilizational scale. The Roman citizenry began to view the empire not as an eternal protector, but as a sinking ship. When the Goths finally arrived, they didn't meet a wall of Roman steel, but a population paralyzed by their own existential dread, waiting for a doom they had already accepted in their minds. Theory number 34. The fall of the West may be best explained by a Newton's third law of empires, where every imperial rise generates an equal and opposite reaction among its neighbors. For centuries, Rome's projection of power, wealth, and diplomacy into the barbarian north did not just dominate the Germanic tribes, it involuntarily organized them. Through contact with the Roman military and trade networks, small, scattered tribes merged into larger and more powerful political structures like the Franks and Goths. These new political units were the direct offspring of the empire's own influence, and they eventually became the very nemesis that would destroy their creator. Rome accidentally acted as a pioneer for the barbarian revolution, teaching its enemies the very tactics, logistics, and governance needed to overthrow a superpower. The empire was not murdered by a strange intruder, but by the mirror image of its own greatness, as the oppressed became the conquerors, using the very tools Rome had provided. Theory number 35. The execution of Stilicho in 408 AD was a catastrophic act of political purging that effectively decapitated the Western Empire's defense. Stilicho, a half-Vandal general who had risen to the rank of Magister Militum, was the only leader with the military genius and diplomatic weight to keep Alaric's Goths at bay. However, the paranoid Emperor Honorius, influenced by jealous court officials, accused Stilicho of treason and had him beheaded in Ravenna. This fatal error of judgment did more than just kill a man. It triggered a wave of xenophobic violence against barbarian soldiers in the Roman army, driving 30,000 of them directly into the arms of Alaric. Without Stilicho to serve as a safe pair of hands, the city of Rome was left in a state of total vulnerability. The Goths no longer faced a peer commander who understood them. They faced a vacuum of leadership that they quickly filled with fire and blood. Rome fell not because it lacked soldiers, but because it murdered the only man who knew how to lead them. Theory number 36. The murderous mismanagement and mistreatment of Goth refugees in 376 AD set in motion a chain reaction of violence that culminated in the Battle of Adrianople. When the Goths sought asylum from the Huns, Roman officials exploited their desperation, selling them dog meat at high prices and forcing them into slavery. This cruel and unusual treatment turned a body of potential allies into a wild and vengeful horde.
The resulting Gothic revolt led to the annihilation of a Roman field army and the death of Emperor Valens, a shock that shattered the myth of Roman invincibility for all time. This was a self-inflicted catastrophe where Roman arrogance created the very enemy that would eventually sack the Eternal City. If the Romans had simply treated the Goths with dignity, the Western Empire might have gained the very manpower it needed to survive the 5th century. Instead, they sowed the wind and reaped the whirlwind of a nation with nothing left to lose.
Theory number 37. A popular but highly contested narrative is the Dung Ages theory, which posits that the rise of Christianity triggered a violent retreat from reason, causing the lights of scientific progress to go out for a millennium. According to this view, as the Church became the new Roman emperor, it prioritized spiritual dogma over empirical observation, leading to a dark age of superstition and backwardness. Proponents argue that the destruction of libraries and the repression of pagan learning caused a civilizational regression where the technologies of the classical world were forgotten or abandoned. While modern scholars dunk on this graph, noting that the empire was already Christian during its last century of vitality, the Dung Ages narrative remains a viral explanation for why Europe became a primitive and barbaric wasteland compared to the heights of the Principate. It frames the fall of Rome as the moment humanity threw its toys out of the pram, trading the laboratory for the cloister and ending the ancient world in a haze of incense and ignorance.
Theory number 38. The collapse of the Roman polis command economy was driven by the failure of a dysfunctional metabolic regime that could no longer feed its massive urban centers. Rome's strength relied on an integrated, redistributive food supply system that extracted grain and taxes from the provinces to sustain non-productive cities. However, a prolonged climate-related late Roman drought in the 4th century undermined the agricultural yields of the southern Black Sea and North Africa, causing the entire system to buckle. The state was unable to maintain the environmental imperialism required to move food across 3 continents, leading to a startling decline in material comfort. As the redistributive network failed, markets became localized, and the once global trade network was replaced by inefficient barter methods. This was a systemic failure of a high-complexity economic model that was ecologically vulnerable to even minor changes in precipitation and temperature. Rome didn't just run out of grain, it lost the capacity to be a connected world, forcing the empire to dissolve into local subsistence economies.
Theory number 39. The Roman middle class was systematically annihilated by a vicious fiscal cycle of excessive taxation designed to fund a failing military machine. As the costs of defending the frontier soared, the state placed an unbearable burden on the class of small property owners who were unable to hide their wealth like the senatorial elite. This massive decapitalization of the most productive layer of society forced farmers to abandon their lands as ruins and seek protection as hereditary castes of laborers on large tax-exempt estates. The financial ruin of the middle class meant that the very backbone of Romanitas was broken, leaving no one to fill local government offices or pay the money taxes that held the empire together. By the time the Goths arrived, the people were starving with the herd and viewed the Roman tax collector as a more immediate threat than any barbarian king. The empire taxed itself to death, hollowing out its own social center until it was nothing more than a den of heartless triflers and forsaken victims.
Theory number 40. A fatal fear of usurpation led later Roman emperors to deliberately sabotage their own army's effectiveness to prevent successful revolts. After the omnishambles of the 3rd century, where over 50 barracks emperors were murdered by their own troops, rulers became more afraid of their generals than of foreign invaders. To forestall successful revolts, emperors like Diocletian fragmented the military command, making units smaller and more dependent on the central court, which sapped the strength of the legions and eroded the political capacity to defend the borders. This continuing grind of civil wars meant that the most capable Roman commanders were often executed or purged before they could achieve situational supremacy. The army remained a superior fighting instrument on paper, but it was crippled by internal instability and a crisis of command. Rome's military was not beaten in the field by superior barbarian technology. It was decapitated by its own masters, who would rather rule over a rump state than risk being overthrown by a powerful and effective general.
If you've made it this far into the video, make sure to subscribe. We plan on making many more videos like this in the future. You can make that happen by simply liking and subscribing.
Theory number 41. The fall of the Western Roman Empire can be attributed to a catastrophic failure of social integration known as the apartness policy. While the Romans had a legendary tradition of incorporating outsiders, by the late 4th century, they made a fatal error by insisting on an effectively permanent apartness for new arrivals, even those who entered with initial imperial approval. This sense of social superiority was most evident in the treatment of Germanic tribes who sought asylum but were met with systematic gatekeeping. Instead of turning these migrants into loyal citizens, Roman officials engaged in the murderous mismanagement of refugees, leading to incidents where starving Goths were forced to sell their children into slavery for a supply of inferior dog meat. This cruelty turned a potential source of manpower into a wild and vengeful horde that eventually shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. By refusing to share the benefits of Romanitas, the empire created a permanent, hostile, alien population within its own borders that had no stake in its survival. Theory number 42. The stability of Rome's polis command economy was terminally undermined by a prolonged climate-related late Roman drought occurring between 360 and 440 CE. This prolonged period of aridity in the southern Black Sea region and North Africa acted as an exogenous shock that destroyed the high-yield agriculture required to sustain the empire's urban millions. This environmental catastrophe was a hidden killer that paralyzed the redistributive food supply system, making the empire's metabolic regime fundamentally dysfunctional. as precipitation shifts sapped the productivity of the agrarian economy, the state found itself unable to maintain its complex integrated networks of trade and taxation. This ecological vulnerability meant that when the harvests failed, the chain of cause and effect led directly to political fragmentation and the eventual fall of the West. Nature's withdrawal of water was a slow and secret poison that left the empire a brittle shell before the first barbarian reached the gates. Theory number 43. The emergence of Sassanid Persia as a peer superpower in the 3rd century fundamentally altered Rome's strategic landscape, as this new dynasty was united on a straightforwardly anti-Roman ticket. Unlike their predecessors, the Sassanids were a centralizing force whose prestige was built on successful wars against Roman emperors, famously capturing Valerian to use him as a footstool. This external threat forced Rome into a state of permanent military and fiscal adjustment, requiring a much higher proportion of resources to be focused on the eastern frontier. This peer competitor created a dangerous power vacuum in the west, as Roman legions were dragged away to face the Persian King of Kings. The necessity of maintaining a two-front military existence exhausted the Roman treasury and made the administrative split into eastern and western halves an irrevocable strategic necessity. Rome was ultimately stretched to the breaking point by a rival that matched its own military might and organizational complexity.
Theory number 44. The late Roman state became terminally dependent on mercenaries and foederati, who lacked any primary loyalty to the Roman government, leading to a total crisis of command. These soldiers for hire were loyal only to their pay, and when the imperial treasury ran dry, they frequently turned their weapons on the very citizens they were hired to protect. This mercenary unreliability was most graphically displayed during the 1527 sack, when a mutinous army of unpaid imperial troops turned the eternal city into a human shambles. Once the last respected leaders like the Duke of Bourbon fell, these leaderless armies devolved into a bloodthirsty mob, treating Rome solely as a source of predation and loot. The empire was essentially decapitated by its own defenders, as the very men who manned the walls were often in secret league with the attackers outside. The sword of Rome was held by hands that were increasingly alien to its cause, leading to a state where integrity was bartered for gold.
Theory number 45. By the 5th century, the Western Empire suffered from a terminal loss of strategic depth, a situation where its borders became so porous that breaches could no longer be prevented, only responded to after the fact. This was driven by a combination of climate change and new disease ecologies that steadily stripped away the empire's reserves of human and plant energy. The Roman army, once capable of tapping inexhaustible reservoirs of manpower, found that its advantage disappeared under the weight of successive pandemics and demographic decline. Rulers were forced to operate with a narrowed margin of error, where one ill-considered settlement or a single lost battle could lead to irrecoverable decline. This loss of situational supremacy meant that the frame of the fragile world had collapsed, leaving the central imperial power unable to exert authority over its lost western provinces. Rome fell because it lost the institutional resilience to defend its own geography against a rising tide of environmental and migratory pressures.
Theory number 46. A core theory for Rome's decline involves Malthusian overreach, where the empire's population simply outstripped the ecological capacities of the Mediterranean basin. Centuries of demographic expansion and intense urbanization created welcoming environments for a range of microbial life forms that evolved alongside increased human density. The unintended conspiracy with nature saw the Romans exhausting their energy subsidy through aggressive deforestation and soil degradation, leaving no margin for error when the climate cooled. This ecological exhaustion meant that the empire reached a point where the resource base could no longer sustain the stupendous fabric of its massive bureaucracy and military. When faced with the microbial mass murderers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the overpopulated and sanitation-poor Roman cities became death traps that leveled the labor base. Ultimately, the empire's growth became its own nemesis as it pushed past the limits of what the ancient natural world could reliably support.
Theory number 47. The early humiliation of the 390 BC Gallic sack instilled a lasting defensive paranoia in the Roman psyche that dictated their strategic behavior for centuries. The memory of the chieftain Brennus throwing his sword onto the scales and crying, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished, became a national trauma that galvanized the Romans to never again suffer such a defeat. This lasting trauma led to a bloody-minded determination not to submit to any foreign power, which drove Rome into a cycle of aggressive, defensive over-expansion. This attitude characterized their expanding defense doctrine, a paranoid belief that Rome had been wronged if any neighbor maintained independence, leading to a perpetual state of warfare. While this tenacious spirit allowed Rome to survive the Punic Wars, it also created the immoderate greatness that eventually caused the empire to yield to its own weight. The fear of a second Brennus ensured that Rome would conquer the world, only to find itself exhausted by the effort.
Theory number 48. As the Roman secular state weakened, aristocratic ambition shifted from the imperial hierarchy to the newly powerful ecclesiastical hierarchy, effectively hollowing out the administration. This ecclesiastical rivalry saw the Roman nobility simply adapt into the church to preserve their social status and regional power when secular paths to advancement were blocked by military dictatorships. The position of bishop became one of immense importance as a form of local leadership, as the elite realized they could excommunicate their enemies rather than merely execute them. This transition from political domination to religious control meant that the will of individual men and women to participate in the political body was lost to spiritual fervor. The church became an independent state within the empire, siphoning off the wealth and intellectual energy of the ruling class. By the time the West fell, the Roman project had been replaced by Christendom, an empire of the mind that abandoned the secular defense of the state for the sake of the church.
Theory number 49. The triumph of Christianity was met with a fierce pagan traditionalism backlash as many blamed the abandonment of the ancient gods for the empire's misfortunes. When Alaric stood at the gates in 410, Roman pagans claimed that if the state had not suppressed the Pax Deorum through the prohibition of sacrifices, the tutelary deities would have protected the eternal city. This religious discord created deep social friction as pagans viewed Christianity as a poison in the vitals that sapped the martial vigor of the populace. Zosimus and other critics argued that the desertion of the traditional rites had caused the gods to withdraw their care, leaving the empire vulnerable to the Gothic trumpet. This psychological crisis forced the Christian Church to produce massive intellectual defenses like Augustine's City of God, which sought to decouple the fate of the soul from the survival of the Roman state. The transition to a Christian empire was thus a period of internal spiritual war that distracted the Romans at the very moment they faced a terminal military threat. Theory number 50. The fall of the West was characterized by a measurable material and moral loss of Romanatus, the very idea of Romanness that had unified 3 continents. By the late 5th century, the citizenship privilege had become so universal that it was effectively worthless as a motivator for military service or political loyalty. Archaeological evidence shows a startling decline in the standard of living, where citizens stopped using high-quality Roman goods like fine pottery, signaling the end of an integrated, advanced civilization. As the central authority in Ravenna was deposed, the population lost its sense of collective identity, withdrawing into small, self-sufficient, primitive communities. This loss of Romanatus meant that while Roman culture may have survived as a spirit or a shadow, the Roman state as a functioning entity had vanished. The eternal city became a barren ruin of its former self, its people having abandoned the duties of citizens and lords to become the subjects of a new medieval world.
Theory number 51. The fundamental bedrock of Roman power was a rigid, obsessive hierarchy of status where everyone knew their place, from the elite senator to the domestic slave. However, the arrival of Christianity introduced a radical, subversive toxin into this system, the doctrine that all were equal in God's eyes. This message acted as an irresistible magnet for those at the very bottom of the Roman ladder, specifically women and female slaves, who saw their inherent value validated for the first time. In some early congregations, the shocking sight of slave women leading men as deaconesses signaled the utter erosion of traditional Roman authority. By preaching that this world and its titles were secondary to the next, Christianity effectively decentered the political body, encouraging a retreat from the civic duties and military service that had sustained the state for centuries. The empire's moral glue was replaced by a universalizing creed that ignored the distinctions of citizenship, turning a once cohesive national project into a fractured community of faith, where the lowliest beggar held as much spiritual clout as the emperor.
Theory number 52. While armies could be defeated and rebuilt, the Roman Empire was ultimately defenseless against the microbial mass murderers that arrived through its own global trade networks. Successive waves of pandemic disease, the Antonine, Cyprian, and Justinianic plagues, acted as a great leveler, slashing the population regardless of rank or wealth. The Antonine Plague, smallpox, struck like a neutron bomb, killing up to 20% of the population and shattering the empire's inexhaustible reservoirs of manpower. Later, the plague of Cyprian turned Rome into a shambles of the dying, with 5,000 people perishing daily at its peak, paralyzing the economy and the military during the 3rd century crisis. Finally, the plague of Justinian wiped out an estimated 50 million people, or half the global population, effectively ending the ancient world and preventing the permanent recovery of the West. These biological catastrophes didn't just kill people, they sapped the plant and human energy reserves of the state, narrowing the margin of error until a single military setback could trigger a total civilizational collapse.
Theory number 53. By the 4th century, the Roman military had morphed into a monstrous budgetary black hole that consumed the empire's lifeblood. To defend an overextended border that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates, the state was forced to fund a permanent force of nearly 500,000 men. This military overspending necessitated a frantic financial debauch, characterized by relentless tax hikes that decimated the middle class and forced small farmers into hereditary serfdom. As defensive spending soared, vital infrastructure like aqueducts, sewage systems, and the legendary Roman road network slid into terminal disrepair. The empire became a military colossus with financial feet of clay, unable to increase its economic output to match the ballooning costs of its own defense. Eventually, the state reached a tipping point of diminishing returns on complexity, where the sheer cost of maintaining the army and bureaucracy far outweighed the benefits of imperial protection, leading many citizens to view the Roman tax collector as a greater threat than the barbarian invaders.
Theory number 54. For centuries, the city of Rome survived on a miraculous agricultural lifeline, a massive, steady flow of grain from the Nile Delta. Egypt was the undisputed breadbasket of the empire, and its surplus was the only reason a non-productive metropolis of 1 million people could exist in a pre-industrial world. However, the foundation of Constantinople in 330 AD as the New Rome created a fatal parasitic rivalry for these resources. The Eastern court began redirecting Egyptian wealth and grain to its own granaries, leaving the Old Rome to face the constant specter of famine. This vulnerability was later weaponized by the Vandals, who seized North Africa and cut off the West's remaining primary grain supply, effectively sentencing the capital to slow starvation. Without the steady energy subsidy of Egyptian and African wheat, Rome's population plummeted from nearly 1 million to a mere fragment of its former size. The mother of the world was essentially starved into submission, losing her status as a global power center because she could no longer feed her own children. Theory number 55. In the year 536 AD, the Roman world was struck by a cataclysmic environmental event that many contemporaries believed was the final judgment. A massive volcanic eruption triggered a mysterious dust veil that darkened the sun for 18 months, causing temperatures to plummet and leading to the late antique Little Ice Age. This global cooling was a landmark event in the history of the human species, causing universal harvest failures and famines. The sudden loss of solar energy sapped the productivity of the agrarian economy, which was the engine of Roman power. This environmental catastrophe arrived at the worst possible moment, just as the Justinianic plague began its trek through the empire's trade routes. The combination of freezing temperatures, lack of food, and biological warfare decimated the population's natural resilience. Nature had essentially withdrawn its favor, transforming the once fertile Mediterranean into a desolate wasteland and providing the exogenous shock that finally pushed the overstretched Byzantine state into a permanent retreat.
Theory number 56. The long road to Rome's fall actually began with a humiliating disaster nearly 800 years before the Goths arrived, the Battle of the Allia in 390 BC. A wild-haired, bare-chested army of Senoan Gauls, led by the warlord Brennus, outmaneuvered and routed a Roman citizen levy just 11 miles from the city. The survivors fled in terror, leaving the city gates open and the ramparts unmanned. The Gauls proceeded to sack and burn Rome, slaughtering the Senate in the Forum and reducing the young superpower to ruins. Though the Romans eventually paid a ransom of 1,000 pounds of gold to get the Gauls to leave, the defeat at the Allia left a lasting trauma in the national psyche. This event instilled a permanent defensive paranoia and a bloody-minded determination to never submit to a foreign power again. This Gallic fear drove Rome into centuries of aggressive, preemptive overexpansion, eventually creating the immoderate greatness that Edward Gibbon identified as the core principle of the empire's ultimate decay.
Theory number 57. The survival of the entire Roman project once hinged on a few honking birds, a legend that forever highlighted the sheer fragility of Roman defenses. During the Gallic siege of 390 BC, a band of Gauls attempted a daring night attack, successfully scaling the steepest cliffs of the Capitoline Hill without alerting the human guards or even the dogs. However, as they neared the summit, they disturbed the sacred geese of Juno. The geese began to honk and flap their wings, alerting the warrior Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, who rushed to the ramparts and hurled the first invaders off the cliff. While this story became a cornerstone of Roman piety and a fondness for geese, it also served as a haunting reminder that the empire's existence was a whim of moment and nature. For later historians, the fact that a world-conquering civilization could have been snuffed out in its infancy, if not for a few noisy birds, proved that Rome's eternality was built on an unstable foundation of luck, which was bound to eventually run out.
Theory number 58. The final attempt to restore the ancient pagan order under Julian the Apostate was derailed by a fatal reliance on false prophecies. Before launching his ambitious campaign against the Sassanid Persians, Julian consulted the Sibyllian books, a collection of sacred oracles dating back to the legendary Roman kings. These books were only opened in times of cosmic crisis, and they issued a stark warning: under no circumstances should you leave your empire. Julian, convinced of his own divine mission, ignored the warning and marched his army all the way to the Persian capital. He soon found himself wandering the desert without a clear strategy, eventually getting stabbed in a minor skirmish because he had neglected to wear his armor. His death in 363 AD marked the final collapse of the pagan revival and the permanent restoration of Christianity. This self-inflicted catastrophe showed that when Roman leaders traded pragmatic strategy for the guidance of shady oracles and old superstitions, the empire lost its ability to navigate the brutal realities of the ancient world.
Theory number 59. The internal cohesion of the later Roman world was shattered not by foreign policy, but by rabid sports tribalism. In Constantinople, the blue and green chariot teams had evolved into violent street gangs and powerful political factions that could make or break an emperor. In 532 AD, this fanatical rivalry took an apocalyptic turn during the Nika riots. After Emperor Justinian attempted to curb their influence, the blues and greens teamed up, shouting Nika, victory or conquer, as they burned half of Constantinople to the ground, including the original Hagia Sophia. Justinian was on the verge of fleeing until Empress Theodora gave her legendary "Royal purple is the noblest shroud" speech, urging him to stay and fight. The revolt only ended after the army trapped 30,000 unarmed fans in the stadium and massacred them. While Justinian survived, the riots demonstrated that Romanitas was rotting into factionalism, where citizens cared more about their sports teams than the survival of the state, turning the capital city into its own worst enemy.
Theory number 60. The most graphic and unbelievably violent sack of Rome in history occurred in 1527, triggered by the assassination of the Duke of Bourbon. Bourbon led a mutinous, unpaid army of outlaws, numbering 20,000 towards the Eternal City. During the first assault on the walls, the Duke was killed instantly, allegedly shot by the artist Benvenuto Cellini, which removed the last shred of authority from his leaderless, bloodthirsty mob. What followed was 8 days of carnage and predation that turned the city into a human shambles. Even pro-imperial cardinals were tortured or sold as slaves, and nuns were raped on sacred altars. The Swiss Guard was all but annihilated during a heroic last stand on the steps of St. Peter's, dying to buy the Pope time to escape. Rome's population plummeted from 55,000 to just 10,000, and many scholars use this grotesque massacre as the official end date of the Italian Renaissance. The death of one leader had unleashed a monster that unmade Rome, proving that without command, the Roman world was nothing but a target for its own defenders. If you've made it this far into the video, make sure to subscribe. We plan on making many more videos like this in the future. You can make that happen by simply liking and subscribing. Theory number 61. During the first siege of Rome in 408 AD, the desperate Senate was forced to strip the city's ancient shrines to pay Alaric's exorbitant ransom. Among the treasures cast into the furnace was the golden statue of Virtus, the personification of valor and intrepidity. The historian Zosimus lamented that as the metal liquefied, the very spirit of Roman courage was totally extinguished. This symbolic liquidation marked a psychological point of no return. By destroying their own sacred monuments to satisfy barbarian greed, the Romans effectively bartered away their national identity. The melting of Virtus was not merely a financial transaction, but a moral bankruptcy that signaled the end of the Roman heart. Theory number 62. The final act of the Roman Byzantine drama occurred in 1453 when Mehmed the Conqueror brought the dawn of modern warfare to the gates of Constantinople. For a millennium, the Theodosian walls had stood as the most formidable defensive structure in the world, yet they were not designed to withstand the impact of gunpowder technology. The Ottomans deployed house-sized cannons, including one so massive it required 90 oxen to move, to methodically batter the ancient stone. These throat-slitters of the new age rendered the traditional Roman defense systems obsolete in a matter of weeks. The fall of the city to artillery fire proved that the Roman state, a relic of antiquity, could no longer compete with the technological military revolution of the rising East.
Theory number 63. While Ottoman cannons signaled the technological end, the literal fall of the last Roman stronghold may have resulted from a single catastrophic human error. During the final siege of 1453, amid the chaos of the assault, it is reported that someone accidentally left one of the smaller gates, the Kirkoporta, open and unbolted. The Ottomans quickly discovered this breach and rushed their janissaries into the heart of the city, effectively ending the defense. This theory suggests that the Roman Empire did not die of a systemic failure in its final hour, but of a simple, tragic oversight by a tired soldier. The Eternal City fell because of a breach of vigilance, a reminder that even the strongest walls are worthless if a single door is left unlocked.
Theory number 64. The economic death spiral of the 3rd century was precipitated by Caracalla's introduction of the Antoninius in 215 AD. Marketed as a double denarius, this coin was an overt act of financial fraud, as it possessed twice the face value, but only 1.5 times the silver weight of a standard denarius. This means of inflation acted as a hidden poison, destroying public confidence in the currency and incentivizing the debasement that would eventually leave the coin with a silver content of mere 0.5%. By the time of Gallienus, these worthless products spewed out by the mints were essentially bronze tokens with a thin silver wash. The double denarius was the engine of hyperinflation that paralyzed long-distance trade and bankrupted the middle class.
Theory number 65. Emperor Constantine sought to stabilize the failing economy by establishing gold monometallism, a move that permanently sundered the Roman social fabric. He introduced the high-purity gold solidus, which served as a stable haven for the imperial bureaucracy and the wealthy elite. However, the silver and bronze currencies used by the middle and lower classes were abandoned to unyielding inflation and continuous devaluation. This created a dual economy that caused the decapitalization of the poor, leaving them at the mercy of a worthless currency while the elite hoarded gold. This polarization stripped the common man of any stake in the empire's survival, turning Roman society into a medieval hierarchy long before the state officially fell.
Theory number 66. In 301 AD, Diocletian attempted to legislatively execute the laws of supply and demand via his edict on maximum prices. This decree fixed the price of 1,300 essential goods and services on pain of death, labeling merchants as speculators and thieves. Instead of curbing hyperinflation, the edict acted as a total market paralyzer. Producers refused to sell at a loss,
causing supplies to vanish into the black market. The formal economy collapsed into an inefficient system of barter and local exchange, which effectively ended large-scale industrial production. This economic suicide by regulation ensured that the empire could no longer sustain the complex networks required to feed its urban centers, forcing a retreat into local subsistence.
Theory number 67. The crushing weight of excessive taxation and economic paralysis led to the terminal collapse of urban dominance in the West. As the cities became tax traps plagued by food shortages and corruption, the wealthy aristocracy enacted a strategy of seclusion and ruralization. They fled to fortified country villas, latifundia, which they transformed into self-sufficient islands of power where they could evade the imperial tax collectors. This mass exodus of leadership and wealth drained the municipalities of their vitality, leaving the urban middle class to vanish. These rustic estates became the precedents for medieval castles, shifting authority from the distant emperor to local lords and signaling the end of the Roman city-state model. Theory number 68. In a final, desperate bid to preserve its failing tax base, the late Roman state created a system of hereditary castes. To ensure revenue for the massive military budget, emperors enacted legislation that legally bound workers to their jobs and land for eternity. Peasants were transformed into coloni, shackled to the soil in a state of permanent apartness and unfree labor. This policy murdered the social mobility that had once made Rome dynamic, creating the structural birth of medieval serfdom. By the time the Goths arrived, the Roman populace was already living in a state of brutal regimentation, treated by their own government as mere tools in an authoritarian machine rather than citizens of a free republic. Theory number 69. The fall of the West may be best explained by Newton's third law of empires, a theory posited by Peter Heather, stating that every imperial rise generates an opposite and equal reaction among its dominated neighbors. For centuries, Rome's projection of power and wealth into the north did not just dominate the Germanic tribes, it involuntarily organized them. Through contact with the Roman military and trade networks, small, scattered groups merged into larger and more powerful political structures like the Franks and Goths. These new entities were the offspring of the empire's own influence and eventually became the very nemesis that would destroy their creator. Rome accidentally acted as a pioneer for the barbarian revolution, teaching its enemies the tactics and logistics required to overthrow a superpower.
Theory number 70. The rise of Sassanid Persia as a peer superpower in the 3rd century dealt a fatal blow to Rome's strategic balance. United on a straightforwardly anti-Roman ticket, the Sassanids announced their arrival with massive victories, including the capture and skinning of Emperor Valerian. This external threat forced Rome to focus a much higher proportion of its fiscal and military resources on the east, creating a permanent power vacuum in the west. Every legion sent to face the King of Kings was a legion taken away from the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Rome was ultimately stretched to the breaking point by a superpower rival that matched its organizational complexity, making the final collapse of the overextended West an inevitable strategic certainty.
Theory number 71. On a fateful New Year's Eve in 406 AD,
Nature itself seemingly conspired against the eternal city when the Rhine River froze solid, creating an icy highway for destruction. A mixed band of desperate vandals, Swaby and Alans, fleeing the terrifying advance of the Huns, crossed the frozen waters at Moguntiacum and began a relentless ravaging of Gaul. This catastrophic breach of the frontier was a death blow to imperial security, as the empire would never again regain control over these lost lands. The sheer momentum of this migration period turned once stable provinces into a fiery landscape of chaos and plunder. As the barbarian hordes poured across the ice, the Roman defensive line collapsed under the weight of an entire people on the move. This was the great calamity that signaled the end of the Rhine barrier, leaving the heart of the West exposed to the cold steel of the northern tribes.
Theory number 72. The spiritual unity of Rome was shattered by the Arian controversy, a theological rift that turned the empire into a battlefield of competing creeds. While the official Roman state eventually embraced Chalcedonian orthodoxy, Germanic tribes like the Goths were converted to the Arian tradition by the missionary Little Wolf. This religious divide created a state of permanent apartness and friction between the new barbarian masters and their Roman subjects. Even a Romanized ruler like Theodoric the Ostrogoth faced immense social strife because of this heretical label pinned on his faith by the Catholic majority. These religious schisms acted as a jagged blade, hollowing out the social cohesion and administrative unity of the state. The empire was so busy arguing over spiritual purity that it failed to notice the barbarian at the gate. Ultimately, the cross was divided, and Rome fell through the cracks of its own fragmented faith.
Theory number 73. The once vibrant local government of the Roman world succumbed to terminal administrative atrophy as the central state seized control of municipal funds to pay for its failing military. This confiscation removed the very incentive for local elites to participate in the political body, turning city centers into tax traps that people fled in dismay. As the machinery of power became increasingly unaccountable and remote, the town councils that had sustained the Pax Romana for centuries simply withered away. Local notables abandoned their civic duties, retreating to self-sufficient country estates where they could evade the state's monstrous bureaucracy and fiscal demands. This systemic failure of the metabolic regime meant that the empire's administrative organs were no longer functioning, leaving the provinces as a collection of checkerboard communities with no loyalty to a distant, parasitic emperor. Rome did not just lose its territory, it lost the very will of its people to govern themselves.
Theory number 74. The Eastern Roman Empire was nearly torn apart by the iconoclastic fury, a period where emperors like Constantine V, derisively called Constantine the Doo-Doo Head, declared war on religious artwork. Believing that images of Jesus and the saints were a form of idolatry, these rulers ordered the systematic destruction of mosaics and frescoes, sparking violent riots and internal upheavals. This fierce religious discord didn't just smash art, It shattered the political bond between the East and the West, as the Pope in Rome was horrified by the emperor's heretical actions. Consequently, the papacy began to look for new protectors among the Franks, effectively granting Italy the privilege of being able to ignore the emperor's commands. The empire's political authority was permanently medievalized as religious fervor replaced national identity, and the dung-named emperor's obsession with purity served only to accelerate the irrevocable split of the Roman world.
Theory number 75. The most earth-shattering treachery in Roman history occurred in 1204, when the warriors of the Fourth Crusade turned their swords against the very Christian capital they were meant to defend. Lured by the promises of limitless wealth and the machinations of Venice, this army of outlaws breached the supposedly impenetrable walls and subjected Constantinople to a sack of unbelievable violence. For 3 days, the Mother of Nations was turned into a human shambles of fire and pillage, with its priceless libraries burned and its holy relics stolen. The empire was effectively annihilated as a political power, replaced by a fragile Latin empire, while the Roman nobility fled to rump states in the wilderness. This unplanned sack by fellow Christians crippled the Roman East 2 centuries before its final fall, proving that the most dangerous enemies were often those who claimed to be allies in faith. Rome's ancient stature was liquidated, leaving only a shadow of its former glory.
Theory number 76. The ultimate symbol of Roman financial ruin arrived when the late state was so destitute that it was forced to pawn the actual crown jewels to Venice to secure military aid. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the great wretched piles of silver and gold that once funded the legions had vanished, leaving the emperors to wear crowns made of glass during their coronations. This shocking act of monetary desperation exposed a superpower that had become a hollow shell, surviving only on the ancient prestige of its name. While emperors like John VIII journeyed to Europe to beg for assistance and offer the very independence of their church as a bribe, the coffers remained empty and the treasury remained thin. The pawning of the jewels wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a moral bankruptcy that signaled the end of the Roman heart, leaving the empire a failed and outdated project that could no longer even afford its own symbols of power.
Theory number 77. The Roman West was strangled by the Vandal naval supremacy, which transformed the Mediterranean from a Roman lake into a Vandal-controlled highway of terror. Led by their ambitious king, Gaiseric, the Vandals seized the vital breadbasket of North Africa and established a powerful maritime empire centered at Carthage. This conquest effectively cut off Rome's primary grain supply, leaving the capital city to face the constant specter of starvation. With their fleet dominating the sea lanes, the Vandals could strike the heart of Italy at will, as they did in the devastating 2-week sack of 455 AD. Rome was powerless to stop this maritime juggernaut, as its own navy had been rendered obsolete by the loss of the African ports. The empire's energy subsidy was redirected to Carthage, leaving the mother of the world to wither in terminal economic collapse and slow starvation.
Theory number 78. Rome became dangerously dependent on a massive forced labor force that had no stake in the empire's survival. During the centuries of expansion,
Cheap and abundant slave labor provided a temporary energy subsidy, but it simultaneously trapped the Roman economy in a cycle of technological stagnation. Because the elite could simply exploit the mute masses of the unfree, there was no incentive for the industrial innovation that might have matched rising costs. This reliance on a distressingly high number of slaves, up to a quarter of the population, created a rigid social hierarchy that was brittle and prone to mass slave revolts. As the influx of new captives ground to a halt, the empire found itself ecologically and technologically exhausted, unable to sustain its monstrous bureaucratic machine. The very labor base that built Rome's marble wonders eventually became its nemesis, as a society built on dehumanization could not find the human energy to survive its own decline.
Theory number 79. A controversial but persistent theory suggests that a silent toxic killer called lead poisoning crippled the Roman upper class and paved the way for civilizational collapse. Proponents argue that the elite consumed a Greek-style diet where wine was sweetened with sapa, a syrup rich in lead-2 acetate, and food was cooked in lead-glazed pottery. Furthermore, the city's sophisticated water supply flowed through extensive lead piping, ensuring that even daily hydration introduced toxins into the blood of the aristocracy. This chronic exposure allegedly resulted in widespread sterility and mental decline, preventing the ruling class from producing talented heirs during the empire's most perilous hours. While many modern scholars discount this theory as being based on false evidence, the idea of a toxic empire poisoned by its own technological sophistication remains a viral narrative. If true, the very engineering marvels that defined Rome became its own biochemical assassin.
Theory number 80. The Roman people suffered a terminal loss of civic virtue as the once proud martial flame was buried beneath a new culture of pusillanimity and distraction. In the twilight of the empire, the governing classes experienced a failure of nerve, abdicating the role of defending the state to foreign mercenaries while they retreated into the sanctuary of the palace. This moral decay meant that citizens received the name without adopting the spirit of Romans, abandoning the dignified duties of military service for the sake of private luxury. The army, once a machine for Romanization, became a collection of alien ethnic units with conflicting loyalties, leading to a crisis of command that decapitated the empire's defense. By the time the Goths arrived, the last sparks of Rome's fighting spirit were finally extinguished, leaving the city to fall not because it lacked soldiers, but because it had lost the collective consciousness to wield the sword.
If you've made it this far into the video, make sure to subscribe. We plan on making many more videos like this in the future. You can make that happen by simply liking and subscribing. Theory number 81. When the Roman Senate sent envoys to Alaric during the first siege, they attempted to overawe the Gothic king by boasting of the city's vast population and their supposed readiness for war. Alaric simply laughed, delivering a chilling retort that defined the era's brutal military reality. The thicker the grass, the easier it is to cut.
This realization highlighted a terminal truth, that Rome's vast numbers were meaningless without the military discipline and martial vigor that had once protected its borders. The city was no longer an invincible fortress, but a ripe harvest ready for the barbarian blade. This psychological blow signaled that the eternal city's reputation had become a hollow facade, a trauma that reverberated throughout the Roman world. By the time Alaric's Gothic trumpet finally sounded through the streets, the privileges of birth and the distinctions of quality had been leveled by the sheer force of northern steel.
Theory number 82. As the power of Rome declined, a strange and fatal geographical shift occurred. The Adriatic Sea began to desert the fortress of Ravenna, the very city that served as the Western Empire's final capital. By a strange fatality, the receding waters left the imperial seat stranded amidst an expanse of pestilential marshes, 4 miles from the ocean that had once provided its security and trade links. This withdrawal of the ocean was viewed as coeval with the gradual degeneracy of the Roman people, a symbolic retreat of nature from a civilization that could no longer command its own shores. Ravenna became an isolated island of imperial stagnation, disconnected from the vital maritime arteries that sustained a healthy monetary economy. By the time the Lombards eventually conquered the region, the city was a melancholy relic, its ancient harbor replaced by a grove of pines.
Theory number 83. The rise of Palatine officials, specifically the eunuch Eutropius, as the power behind the throne in Constantinople, created a toxic crisis of command that alienated the Western military. Eutropius was depicted as a monster of greed, a cadaverous figure who manipulated the young Emperor Arcadius while keeping the entire court under constant surveillance. His fierce rivalry with the Western general Stilicho effectively paralyzed imperial coordination during the empire's most perilous hours. By declaring Stilicho a public enemy and encouraging the Goths to divert their raids toward the west, Eutropius used the barbarian tribes as pawns in a suicidal political game. This internal fracture ensured that while the two eyes of the world fought for domestic dominance, the Gothic and Vandal threats were allowed to fester until they were strong enough to dismantle the western provinces entirely.
Theory number 84. The Western Empire's fall was accelerated by the abject imbecility of Emperor Honorius, a ruler more devoted to his flocks of poultry than the defense of his people. While Alaric's Goths were on the march, Honorius remained secluded in the swamps of Ravenna, a puerile tyrant who was easily manipulated by unscrupulous counselors. In a crowning moment of historical idiocy, it is reported that when a eunuch informed him that Rome had perished, Honorius was initially shocked, thinking the news referred to a favorite chicken he had named Rome. Upon learning it was merely the city that had fallen, he expressed a sigh of relief. This total failure of nerve and focus on sweet trivialities led to the execution of his only capable general, Stilicho, and left the eternal city a barren target for its own defenders turned assassins.
Theory number 85. The 1527 sack of Rome acted as a terminal blow to the High Renaissance, triggering a massive artistic diaspora that forever altered the cultural landscape of Europe. As the mutinous army turned the city into a human shambles, the successors of Raphael and Michelangelo were forced into a desperate exodus. This displacement facilitated the rise of mannerism, a courtly art of stylish style that rejected classical harmony in favor of anxious, complex compositions reflecting the psychological trauma of the period. Artists fled to the courts of Venice, Mantua, and France, spreading the first Roman manner to the rest of the continent as they escaped the iconoclasm and violence of the Eternal City. Rome's status as the unofficial capital of learning was liquidated, its libraries burned, and its collections dispersed, signaling the end of humanism's favor within Christian thought.
Theory number 86. In the aftermath of the sack, a fanatical eschatological fever gripped the Christian world, with many convinced that the Goths were the prophetic Gog from the book of Ezekiel, destined to bring about the end of the world. This rhetoric transformed Alaric's army into a supernatural force of divine judgment rather than a mere group of armed climate refugees. Radical Christian thinkers argued that Rome had become a new Sodom, suffering a well-deserved punishment for its blasphemies and corruption. This apocalyptic atmosphere encouraged a retreat from the secular world as the populace abandoned hope in the imperial structure and sought salvation in the city of God. By framing the Goths as instruments of the final judgment, the Church diverted the people's military spirit into spiritual fervor, hollowing out the last remnants of civic virtue.
Theory number 87. The religious landscape of the late Empire was irrevocably fractured by the missionary Ulfilas, or Little Wolf, who converted the Gothic tribes to the Aryan faith. By creating the Gothic alphabet and translating the Bible into their native tongue, Ulfilas instilled a version of Christianity that the Roman authorities branded as heretical. This created a permanent barrier to cultural fusion, as the Aryan Goths were treated with systematic gatekeeping and permanent apartness by the Orthodox Roman majority. This religious discord acted as a jagged blade, hollowing out social cohesion and preventing the tribes from ever being fully accepted as Roman. When these wrong sort of Christians finally sacked Rome, they viewed themselves as avengers of the true faith, adding a layer of sacred violence to the barbarian torch.
Theory number 88. Long before the final collapse, the Roman money economy was severely weakened by the constant raiding of Mediterranean supply lines by Cilician pirates. These hijackers of the sea transformed the Mediterranean into a highway of terror, engaging in human trafficking and plundering the vital cargo ships that fed the city of Rome. The disruption was so severe that it triggered a war on terror-style response, prompting the Roman people to vote almost unlimited powers to one man, Pompey, to clear the seas. While Pompey was successful, the crisis had already established a dangerous precedent: the abandonment of republican institutions in favor of the unilateral rule of a military strongman. This erosion of the social contract made the state increasingly vulnerable to the usurpation and civil war that would eventually characterize the terminal decline of the empire.
Theory number 89.
The foundation of Constantinople in 330 AD as the New Rome permanently shifted the empire's center of gravity to the east, effectively sentencing the West to slow starvation. This new capital was closer to the rich, urbanized provinces and protected by the formidable Theodosian walls, making it a much more secure seat of power. As the machinery of power ceased to be centered in Italy, the western half became a secondary concern, drained of its tax base and its inexhaustible reservoirs of manpower. The redirection of wealth and grain from Egypt to the east left the old Rome to face the constant specter of famine. This administrative split meant the poorer West was left to defend a porous frontier with dwindling resources, while the East often bribed invaders to move toward Italy instead.
Theory number 90. The total disintegration of the Roman Republic can be traced back to the revolutionary precedents set by the generals Marius and Sulla. They were the first to march their own legions on Rome, an act that shattered the social contract and broken constitutional customs that had held the state together for centuries. Marius began the trend of making armies loyal to an individual general rather than the state, while Sulla used his power as dictator to carry out prescribed hit lists of his political enemies. This internal strife turned the Roman instinct for violence inward, ensuring that the eternal city would fall not because of external strength, but because it had lost the collective consciousness required to maintain a representative government. Every subsequent strongman, from Caesar to the barracks emperors, merely followed the bloody trail blazed by these first military usurpers.
Theory number 91. The Roman social fabric was paralyzed by a profound status dissonance, where the most despised and dehumanized members of society, the gladiators, became the empire's most worshipped and seductive celebrities. In the blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum, the Roman SPQR found a lethal distraction from their own political disenfranchisement as the plebeian mobs traded their civic duties for the narcotic of bread and circuses. This obsession with violent spectacle transformed the city into a symbolic theater of dominance, where the fate of the other was decided by the fickle thumbs of a decadent populace. Yet this thirst for carnage was merely a symptom of a deeper moral rot, a civilizational ouch time, where the martial vigor of the legions was replaced by the staged professional butchery of the arena. As the people cheered for the death of the prisoner, they were blind to the fact that their own imperial structure was being hollowed out by a systemic loss of civic purpose. Ultimately, the amphitheater was not a monument to strength, but a cage where a dying society watched its own reflex of destruction play out until the lights of the ancient world finally flickered into darkness.
Theory number 92. The arrival of the Huns was viewed by contemporaries not as a mere military migration, but as a supernatural force of divine judgment that outstripped even the fastest rumors in its terrifying speed. These nomadic masters of the Eurasian steppe wielded composite reflex bows that could rain death from horseback with unerring precision, rendering the slow, heavy infantry formations of the traditional Roman legions practically obsolete. Led by the fearsome Attila, the Huns acted as a microbial mass murderer of Roman military doctrine, forcing the empire into a strategic nightmare where breaches of the frontier could no longer be prevented, only responded to after the catastrophe had already occurred. Their fluid, liquid style of warfare shattered the Theodosian walls of Roman confidence long before they actually reached the gates of the capital. By the time the Battle of the Catalian Plains ended in a bloody, inconclusive stalemate, the Western Empire was so drained of its manpower reserves that it was forced into desperate, unsustainable alliances with its own barbarian enemies. Rome fell because it could not adapt its rigid iron shell to the lightning fire of the Hunnic whirlwind.
Theory number 93. Many historians point to the Great Sickness of 37 AD as the precise moment the Roman project first began its descent into the abyss of tyrannical insanity. This theory suggests that a severe illness, possibly a psychotic break or brain fever, transformed the young beloved Caligula from a playful prince into a sadistic, homicidal maniac who famously replaced the faces of gods with his own. This transformation highlighted the terrifying flaw in the imperial succession, the fact that the welfare of 60 million people rested on the fragile mental stability of a single youth gifted with absolute power. As the Viper of Rome began murdering his own relatives and declaring war on the ocean, the SPQR realized too late that their golden age was built on an unstable foundation of luck. This pattern of royal wackos would recur for centuries, with later leaders like Nero and Commodus draining the treasury and murdering their own citizens in a fever dream of ego and blood. Rome didn't just fall to foreign swords, it was decapitated by the biological accidents of its own rulers' minds.
Theory number 94. The reign of Elagabalus serves as a grotesque symbol of the decadence and satiety that eventually suffocated the spirit of the Roman West. Allegedly a 14-year-old fashion freak who never wore the same shoes twice, his most infamous act was the rose petal execution, where he supposedly smothered his dinner guests under a deluge of flowers until they died of excess. This frantic financial debauch was more than just a tabloid scandal. It represented a system that had lost all gravitas and sense of serious public duty. While the barbarians were probing the porous frontiers, the head of the world had become a coda mundi, the tail of the world, inhabited by a decadent elite more interested in the metaphysical nature of the sun god than the defense of the Rhine. This symbolic insanity showed an empire that was ecologically and technologically exhausted, its ruling class having retreated into a dream world of nightingales' tongues and ostrich brains, while the real world was already in flames. The empire fell because it was choked by its own opulence, smothered by the very petals of its own happiest age.
Theory number 95. The terminal horror of the Roman famine was codified by the Senate in a desperate and gruesome decree. They offered 3,000 sestertii for every 10 bodies cast over the city walls into the ditches below. This 3,000-body decree signaled the utter collapse of the urban sanctity and burial traditions that had defined Roman civilization for 1,000 years. As the Tiber River became a clogged artery of human wreckage and the streets turned into a human shambles, the eternal city was effectively transformed into a vast, unburied tomb. This demographic collapse acted as a neutron bomb that leveled the labor base, leaving the state apparatus too large for the surviving population to support.
The pestilence had so thoroughly swallowed most of the testimony of life that the living were as silent as the dead, cowering in their palaces as snakes coiled around the necks of the starved corpses in the gutters. Rome fell when it could no longer distinguish between its sacred dwellings and the mire of the dying. Theory number 96. According to the theory of Newton's third law of empires, the very success of Roman expansion generated an equal and opposite reaction among its originally dominated neighbors that eventually culminated in its own demise. For centuries, the projection of Roman power and wealth into northern Europe did not merely subdue the Germanic tribes, it involuntarily forced them to evolve into larger and more powerful political structures like the Franks and Goths. These new entities were the direct offspring of the empire's own influence, having learned Roman tactics, logistics, and administrative efficiency through centuries of diplomatic and military contact. By providing a pioneer for the barbarian revolution, Rome accidentally taught its enemies how to dismantle a superpower. The imbalance of power in favor of the Mediterranean was steadily eroded by this conspiracy with nature and the rise of these mirror image rivals. Ultimately, the empire was not murdered by an external intruder, but by the nemesis it had spent 500 years creating.
Theory number 98. The Roman middle class and the class of small property owners were systematically taxed to death by a vicious fiscal cycle designed to fund an insatiable military machine. To pay for bloated military budgets and incessant bribes, the late Roman state levied crippling tax rates on marginal land, forcing peasants to abandon their lands as ruins and seek protection as hereditary castes of laborers on the massive estates of the elite. This fiscal disintegration created a society of disenfranchised victims who viewed the Roman tax collector as a more immediate threat to their lives than any Goth or Vandal. To ensure revenue, the state resorted to corrupt, brutal regimentation, legally chaining workers to their professions in a generational prison that marked the true birth of medieval serfdom. As the money economy collapsed and trade became a localized barter system, the citizenry lost all stake in the empire's survival. Rome was ultimately starving with the herd, having committed economic suicide by prioritizing its legions over the very people they were meant to defend. Theory number 99. The once potent shield of the phrase civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, was fatally undermined when the Emperor Caracalla published the Antonine Constitution in 212 CE, granting citizenship to all free men in the empire. While appearing to be a gesture of universal equality, this move was a cynical attempt to expand the tax base and the pool for military service, which ultimately led to the universal devaluation of the Roman identity. When citizenship was a rare privilege, it acted as a powerful magnet of loyalty and an incentive for incorporation. However, once it became a common status, it was effectively worthless as a motivator for sacrifice. This dilution of Romanitas meant that the Goths and Vandals could learn the Roman way without ever feeling a pulse of genuine allegiance to the state. By 410 AD, the privileges of birth were so thoroughly leveled that the Roman soldier had more in common with his barbarian adversary than with his own emperor in Ravenna. The empire fell because it traded the soul of its identity for the desperate gold of the tax collector. Finally, we have reached theory number 100.
The final theory of the story without end suggests that the Roman Empire never truly fell at all, but instead exists as a spirit or a shadow that continues to define the modern world. Historians like Bertrand Lanson argue that the fall is a paradigm we use to reflect our own fears, while the reality was a complex cultural transformation where Roman institutions were simply remolded into the Catholic Church and the nation-states of Europe. Even after the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, the machinery of power remained Roman in language, law, and architectural influence, as the barbarian kings fought to be mini-Romes rather than destroyers. From the 12 tables of law to the very words you are reading now, Roman civilization has simply moved into a new phase of eternality through the empire of the mind. If you live in a society based on representational government, use the Julian calendar, or speak a Romance language, you are an inhabitant of the Roman Empire's final immortal transformation. Rome lives on as a collective consciousness, proving that though its stones have crumbled, its idea remains invincible.